Hi again, and welcome to Lesson 9 of Android App Development Training Course. Today, you will learn the basic concept of intent. We'll explore the difference between explicit and implicit intents. You will learn how to navigate from one activity to another activity and be able to pass important data or messages between these activities, as well as to send data between apps. At the end of this lesson, you should be able to modify your previous slot machine application and apply the concept of intent to add activity in your application. To demonstrate this, we will be working with the same application I discussed in the previous lesson. Just to recap, we have an app that has a text view, 3 image views, and a button. When this button draw is pressed, the 3 image views will randomly display fruit images, and the text view on top will display an appropriate message based on whether no apple, 1, 2, or 3 apples were randomly drawn. Finally, the change in orientation does not affect the current UI display. This is the concept that we discussed in the previous lesson on how to save and restore data between orientation change. Let's have a quick recap of the code and the layout on how this app was accomplished. We have 2 layout files for this activity, one for portrait and one for landscape. In the main activity, we declared 2 class-level variables, message and images. These 2 are responsible for saving and restoring the UI state as the device orientation change. In here, we use 2 constants, message and images, as keys to reference this saved data. We also have 3 lazy variable declarations for the views in our layout. Over here is the overridden function onSaveInstantState, where we save our message and images. And the remaining functions are as follows. To display a message on whether 1, 2, or 3 apples were drawn. To get the count on how many apples were drawn. This is where we randomize the fruit images. This is where we assign the random image to the images array. This is executed when the button draw is clicked. And this is where we display the random images in the image views. We will not be modifying most of these functions anyway, so I'll just collapse it. Also, in the strings.xml, we only have 2, the app name and the show.apple. So far, we only have one activity, which is the main activity, and it has 2 XML layout files. Now, suppose I want to add another activity, and I want that new activity to be the launcher activity, meaning when our app launches, that new activity will be the first one to see and not this one. To do that, I need to rename this main activity by pressing Shift F6, and then I'll change it to Game Activity, and click Refactor. This changes the class name, but you don't see the change in here yet. And now, to make it consistent with the layout, I'll also rename this activity_main by pressing Shift F6 and change this to activity_game, and then click Refactor. See that both XML layout files were renamed, as well as this game activity. But then, we now have a problem in our game activity class. Our code breaks since it is looking for the auto-generated view binding class that is based on the XML layout file name. And instead of the activity main binding class, the auto-generated class is now activity game binding. I'll change this one as well. There is still an error because we are still trying to import a package that no longer exists. So I'll delete it. Let's run our app first to see that this application still works. And it is still perfectly working, same as before. So now, to add a new launcher activity, simply right-click your app and choose New Activity, and I want an empty activity for this. This is now our new main activity, and then I'll enable this that says Launcher Activity, and click Finish. We now have 2 activity files and 3 layout files. Now before I add components to this layout, I'll open my Android manifest file. Since this newly added main activity is set to be the launcher activity, I don't want that the game activity is also set as the launcher activity. So I'll remove this code, and then going back to the layout file, I want this main activity to have a text view component on top of the screen, and it says, "Welcome to Lucky Apple Slot Machine." Then I want one image view that displays an apple. I'll also change the width and the height of this to a fixed value of 150 dp. And I'll add a constraints as well. Finally, I need a button at the bottom part. And then I'll create a vertical chain to these three components. And so far it looks good. I'll change the button text to Start Game. And then set the layout width to 0 dp. This matches the parent constraint. I'll also add a margin. Also the height, I want a fixed 70 dp. Finally, to access this button programmatically, I'll give it an ID of button start. And then for the text view, its ID is text view main. Okay, let's check this in the emulator. And as you can see, the main activity is now being displayed first and not the game activity. Obviously, it doesn't have any functionality yet, but the layout looks good in both orientations. I'll modify this one and I'll increase the text size of these to 18 sp. So to add functionality to this button start, I'll first add a binding variable here of type activity main binding, and then I'll instantiate it. To navigate to the game activity, when this button start is clicked, we need to create a variable I'll call intent. And you can use any variable name for this one. An intent in Android is a messaging object used to request another app component to perform an action. Intent facilitates users to communicate with app component through several ways, such as starting an activity, starting a service, delivering a broadcast receiver, and so on. Its most significant use is the launching of activities, where it can be thought of as a glue between activities. So it is basically a passive data structure holding an abstract description of an action to be performed. This constructor can accept different parameters, but commonly, you specify the general action to be performed. You have actions like action view, action edit, action main, and so on. For complete discussion of these actions, you may refer to developer.android.com, and using this constructor that accepts two parameters, I can use this to launch an app by providing this specific web address. I'll copy-paste my YouTube playlist URL here. Since the second argument expects a type URI, so I'll convert this to URI. And then to start the activity, all we need is to call this function startActivity and then pass in that intent. Now, let's run and test our app. When I click Start, it launches a new activity pointing to a YouTube playlist that I have specified. And when I press back, it closes that activity and goes back to this main activity. But what if the activity that we want to start is part of our app and we have to explicitly specify it in our intent? This is what we call explicit intent. I'll comment out this code first and create a new intent variable. This time, I can use this constructor that accepts a context and a class parameter. So, for the context, I'll pass in this context. And for the class, I want my game activity. And when you do this, you have to put this : class.java. This points to the game activity class. So, let's check our app. And when I click the Start button, it starts the game activity, and you can interact with this activity same as before. When I press the back button, it finishes the game activity and back to the main activity. So now, what if you want some data to be passed in from this main activity to the game activity when you press this start button? Also, what if you have important data from this activity that needs to be returned to the main activity when I press this back button? And to do this, I will not be using this start activity function. I will use a secondary attribute, extras, to provide extended information to the component such as a class that we need to start. You can use any of these put extra functions depending on what type of data you want to extend. The first argument is the name of type string. It could be any name. And the second argument depends on what type of extra data you want. Well, I also wanted a string. I can replace this literal string with a constant val header, and then replace this string with this header constant. Similarly, I can extract this as a string resource and give it a name, press draw. Now, instead of calling the start activity function, I'll call this start activity for result function. This expects two arguments, an intent and a request code of type int. So I'll pass in my intent variable, and you can use any integer code here. So I'll say 1, but to make it uniform, I'll create another constant here, request underscore code, with a value of 1, and then use it here instead of this numeric literal. Now, for this data to be received by the game activity when this activity starts, I'll declare a variable here called extra of type string. And then, I'll receive that extra data by using this intent.getStringExtra function. You can use any appropriate getExtra function depending on your expected data to be received here. This function expects an argument, the name of the extra, and in our case, we called it header. Now, there is an error because this returns a nullable string. To resolve this, I'll use the elvis operator again. That is, in case this function returns null, I want a string show.apple to be used instead. So, for this extra message to be displayed in our text view in this game activity, I'll open this display message function, and if the apple count is neither 1, 2, or 3, then the message will be this string extra. Let's try this one first and see what we have accomplished so far. When I press the start button, notice that the message displayed in the game activity is now press draw instead of show.apple. We have successfully passed an extra data to this activity using an intent. I'll test this game activity and everything looks good so far. So now, when I press the back button, what if I want to change the information being displayed here? But that information must come from the game activity as a return data once finished. I'll collapse this first. And to send something back to the main activity, we can override this finish function that automatically fires when this activity finishes by pressing the back button. I'll declare here another intent object I'll call data. Similarly, I'll call the put extra function, and I still want to pass a string data. For the string name argument, I'll create another constant I'll call return key, and then suppose the string data that I want to return is thanks for playing. I'll also extract this as a string resource. And lastly, I need to call the setResult function and pass in a result code, activity.resultOK, and then the data. Now, going back to the main activity, to receive this data from the game activity, I'll override a function called onActivityResult. This function has three parameters: request code, result code, and a nullable intent. So, I'll check if the result code is equal to activity.resultOK, or simply result OK, it's just the same. And at the same time, the request code is equal to request code. Then, I'll create a local variable return value and will assign it with this nullable intent data parameter. And using this getStringExtra function, I'll use this same return key to get this data. And if this data is null, I have an alternate value of welcome player. Now you can either use a toast or a snack bar message to display the content of this return value variable. I'll use the text view main, the text attribute, to display this return value. So let's run our app again to see if it works. Initially, it says here, welcome to Lucky Apple slot machine. And when I press start game, it passes the press draw string to this game activity, and I can play the game as usual. And when I press the back button, I was able to pass back the message, thanks for playing. I'll show you another way of passing extra data, but this time we'll do it through implicit intent. To illustrate this, I want to create another Android resource file I'll call menu game, and this Android resource is of type menu. In here, you'll see a similar XML layout but intended for a menu. I want to use an icon for this menu, so I'll create a new vector asset and choose a clip art, and I'll look for share. I'll change the name to IC_share, and also I want this icon to be white. Now to use this icon, I'm going to add a menu item to this menu. I'll change the title of this menu item to share and the ID to item share. Now I'll choose an icon which is this IC_share, and since we only have one menu item, I want this to always be displayed on the top right corner of my app bar. So now, to actually display this menu in our game activity, we need to do a little bit of coding. So I'll override this onCreate options menu, and it has one parameter of type menu which is nullable, and it returns a Boolean type. To make this menu render in the display, we need to inflate it by calling menuInflator.inflate. This requires two arguments. First is the menu resource ID, so I'll get it from r.menu.menu_game. Then the second parameter menu, I'll get it from this menu parameter as well. And before I add a functionality to this menu, let's see it first in the emulator if this menu already shows up. And when the game activity starts, the menu item share appears, but as of now, nothing happens yet when I click it. To add a functionality to this, I'll override this options menu item selected. This accepts a parameter of menu item, and for us to respond what to do when a specific menu item is selected, I need to create a condition first. If we have multiple menu items here, we can use the when operator, but I'll simply use an if statement to know whether the menu item that was selected is the item share. We simply use the resource ID to compare, and if it's true, I'll create another intent variable, and we can apply multiple attribute setting to this intent object using this apply function. I'll say that the action is action send. Previously, you've seen me using the action view when we've launched the YouTube playlist. Also, I need to send an extra data. Again, we need a name of type string. I'll show you another way. You can use the intent.extra_text. Previously, I've shown you how to use a constant string to do this. And then, the value that I want to send is a string, Lucky Apple slot machine. And I want another text on the next line. I can use a \n here. This is same as Java. And say, you draw. I'll put this on the next line so you can see everything. And I want to display how many apple counts were drawn. I'll call here the getAppleCount function, and convert the returned integer type to string. Then, on the next line, I'll put the current system date and time. One last thing, I need to specify what type of intent data this is. It is of type plain text. In an implicit intent, we must include enough information for the Android system to determine which of the available components is best to run with that intent. So, to start the activity, we simply call this function startActivity and pass in this intent. I'll also place here return true because this overridden function expects a Boolean return value. Now, let's run and test our app. The main activity displays a text, "Welcome to Lucky Apple Slot Machine." Clicking the Start button creates an explicit intent and puts an extra data of type string. Press draw. This is received by this game activity. I can play the game as usual. And then, by clicking this item share menu item, creates an implicit intent that sends an extra data of type plain text. This allows the system to properly determine what component can best run for this type of data. And I only have few applications here that can accept this plain text value. I have Mail, Messages, Bluetooth, and Google Drive. I've already configured my Gmail account here in this emulator, so I'll select this, and it launches the Mail application, and the extra information is accepted here in the body of this email. I can now supply the recipient and the subject fields and click Send. But for me, I will not do it since this is no longer part of our app. Instead, I'll just discard this email, and it goes back to our game activity with a toast message that says "Message discarded." Similarly, when I press the back button, the game activity finishes and sends back another extra data to the main activity that says "Thanks for playing." Thus, we can repeat the same process over and over again. I'd like to add another piece of visual information here. Notice that it doesn't have an up button that navigates up to its parent activity. When working with multiple activities in your app, and if you want to establish proper hierarchy such as parent activity and child activity relationship, you can easily do that in the Android manifest.xml. You can add this attribute to your game activity, parent activity name, and then set it to main activity. See that the main activity doesn't include an up button, but the game activity now shows an up button that allows you to navigate back. One major difference though as compared with the hardware back button. Pressing this up button doesn't trigger the finish function. This also recreates the parent activity. So, with our current code, you will not see the message from the game activity "Thanks for playing" being displayed here in the main activity. Unlike when you press the hardware back button. As a programming challenge, try to modify your previous slot machine app challenge so that instead of having a fixed initial coins set to 10, your app should have a main activity where you can set the initial coins. And when you click the Start button, this coin value will be passed as an extra data to this game activity. You can play the game as usual, you can bet 5 coins or 10 coins, and when you press the back button, the current coin value will be sent to the main activity. This coin value must be displayed in a snack bar as well as in the edit text component. You can put here a different value, say 195, and click the Start button again, and this value will be passed in the game activity, and then you can play the game again. You can also click this menu item to share your current coin status to any component available in your Android device. If you choose an email, Then, the string data being passed here is Lucky Apple slot machine, and then the remaining coins, as well as the date and the time. You can try sending this to one of your emails to verify the message, but I'll discard mine. Again, thanks for watching. If you learned something of value here, please click the like and subscribe button for more programming tutorials. This is Joe Edgo and hope to see you in the next video lecture.